Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Angel, and today we're doing some more Halloween DIYs. For this first project, you're going to grab one of these plastic skulls from Dollar Tree, and I started by giving it just one coat of my black chalk paint. Then I kind of wanted to do a romantic twist on this skull, so I grabbed these air dry clay molds that I got from Amazon with some of my air dry clay, and I just started kind of pressing out random flowers and the parts of the leaves. Once I had a few of these made, then I figured out where I wanted to place these on the skull. Now, one thing I will say is that you need to kind of make sure that the weight is the same because these clay pieces are a little bit heavy, so making sure that the weight difference is the same on both sides will prevent this from falling over. Or if you wanted to, you could definitely put a hole in the bottom of this skull, maybe add some rocks or rice or something heavy to help hold this up. Then after I glued all my pieces down to the skull, I went back in and did another coat of my black chalk paint over the clay pieces and also a second coat over the skull. Then finally, to bring out all those beautiful details on these floral molds, I went back in with some of my European gold rub and buff and a little brush, and I just brushed over the clay pieces. I'm always looking for unique ideas of how to display all of my beautiful books that I have. So for this one, I grabbed one of these larger Dollar Tree skeletons and started out by gluing his head so that it would stay in place. And then I also glued all of his arm pieces together because I wanted those to reach outward to sit on top of my books. So as you can see here, as I'm positioning his arms and gluing them, I am using the books that I'm actually going to have him holding so that I can figure out where I need his limbs. So once I had his arms all done, I realized his legs were a little bit long because my thought process was that I wanted his feet to be resting right against the books. So I did start by gluing the top pieces of his legs into his hip bones, but then for the bottom part, I cut those bottom pieces a little bit to make them shorter, and then I am gonna hot glue the open part to the top of his leg and glue his feet standing upward. And again, I just used one of my books to figure out where I needed to cut those. Then once I had him all glued together, I took him outside to give him 2 coats of my Rust-Oleum gold spray paint. I also decided to give him a little witch hat, so I'm just using one of these witch hats from Dollar Tree and then some of my adhesive velvet black paper, which I'm going to use to recover this little witch hat. So I removed all those little pipe cleaners and then placed this onto the sticky side of that velvet paper. Then I just started working around and twisting this around, but I'm also pinching that velvet paper a little bit to make the hat look wrinkled. And after I covered it, then I just used some hot glue to attach this to the top of the skeleton head. And to dress it up just a little bit, I decided to add a band of my velvet gold ribbon. And then I just added my books into his lap. This next project is super easy if you don't want to take the time to actually make a spooky ghost mirror. Then you can print off this free template from Stewart. I'll have it linked below. in my description, but I just had mine printed off at Walgreens on a poster board, so it's a little thicker and I can work with it to make this even more spooky and to make it look even more like a mirror. If you click the link in the description below to go to the Martha Stewart website, you'll also see she's going to do this tutorial a little bit different than I am. I'm just doing this as easy as possible to make this look like a spooky mirror. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have any metallic silver paint on hand. If you've been here a while, you know I love gold, so I had tons of the folk art metallic gold paint, and I just ended up mixing some of that with some gray paint to make my own shiny silver paint. But definitely, if you have metallic silver paint, that would work best for this project. So after I mixed up my gold metallic paint with some gray paint, then I'm gonna wet down a piece of sponge. Any sponge will work. This is just one I had on hand. So just make sure that your sponge is nice and wet, not dripping, but wet enough that the paint is gonna stay wet the entire time that you're doing this. And I'm just gonna dip my sponge down in the paint, and then as you can see, I'm blotting the majority of the paint back off of my sponge before I go in, and I am barely touching this poster board as I'm doing this, but I am just tapping that sponge all over this poster. I'm just going to continue working this sponge and that little tiny bit of paint all over this poster until I was quite happy with the results of it. Now, like I said, I'm going in very lightly at first, but I do go back in after this first coat dries, and then I can make it a little bit thicker without overdoing it. Also, as you can see, I do go over the hands on here with this paint as well. But again, when I'm doing that, it's just very light coats. And I'm going to end up concentrating the most paint on the edges of this. Now, once I have this entire poster board covered with that paint, then I'm just going to take my sponge and really barely touching this again, just go back and forth and up and down with that sponge to kind of smear in the paint. And then you can just keep sponging on and wiping back and forth and up and down until you're happy with the way it looks. Now, once I was finished, I grabbed a thrift store frame that would fit this, took it outside along with this poster board, and I spray painted my frame gold. And then on this poster board, I just wanted to add a little bit of gold to it. So I ended up spritzing it and kind of letting the gold spray paint drip a little bit onto this poster template. And finally, once everything was dry, all I had to do was add this to my frame. If you've been following along for a while, you'll know that I made over these jack-o'-lanterns last year to do the Pottery Barn terracotta dupes on them. And this year, Pottery Barn has black terracotta jack-o'-lanterns. So of course, to go with all of my other decor this year, I wanted to make these over again. So I'm basically doing the same exact thing that I did last year, starting out by painting these black with my black chalk paint, and then I'm using some flour and brushing that into the pumpkins. Before you add the flour onto your jack-o'-lanterns, you just want to make sure that they are tacky dry and not too wet, so that when you brush your paintbrush back over this, it doesn't make those clumpy pieces. As you can kind of tell in the video, for my first jack-o'-lantern, I didn't wait long enough for that paint to dry, and you can kind of see those little clumpy pieces that I ended up having to go back in and brush off once this was completely dry. For my second one, I did let it dry a bit longer until the paint was tacky. But just continue working that flour in with your your brush and your fingers until you're happy with the look of it. Now the inside of my pumpkin was still an orange color, so I wanted to make it gold, kind of like the other Pottery Barn pumpkins that they have. So I ended up taping off their eyes, nose, and mouth, and also taping off the bottom part of this with a plastic bag so that I could use some of my Rust-Oleum Gold spray paint to spray down in the inside. Then finally, I just touched up the bottom of these and sealed them with some Aleene's acrylic sealer. For this final project, I grabbed one of these little shadow box frames that I got from the thrift store, and I started by taking this frame apart, and then I painted both of these little frames with some of my black chalk paint. Once they were dry, I stacked them back together just so I could see where the details would show on these frames, and I used some of my European Gold Rub and Buff, went over a lot of the details and some of that inner frame. Now I ended up using the backing piece that was in the frame for this project, and here I am covering it up with some of my velvet adhesive paper, but this is going to get messy. I do end up having to recover it, so I recommend not covering this until after we do the clay part. So the idea for this was to have a ghost looking like he was coming out of this frame. Since it was a shadow box frame, I figured this would be perfect for it. So I grabbed some of my air dry clay and I started rolling it out. You're gonna need kind of a larger piece for this, and you wanna make it as thin as possible, but not too thin that it's gonna tear. So really, depending on the size of your frame will depend on the piece that you'll need. Once I had my piece rolled out, then I grabbed one of these little foam balls from Dollar Tree, and I'm gonna place it right in the center of my rolled out piece of clay because I wanted this ghost to look 3D. And here you see I'm placing a dowel into that foam ball, but that's just to hold this up while I'm working my way around this and making the little pleats in the ghost sheet. If you needed to make this easier for you, you could put that dowel into another piece of foam to hold it up, but it was easy enough to just kind of twirl this around and work with the clay to make those pleats. And once I was happy with how the ghost looked, then this is where my back piece kind of started to get messy because I needed to use a little bit of water on my finger to smooth out any of the little cracks or anything in my ghost. And also, you may notice right here, I decided my ghost wasn't long enough. I wanted that back piece to go down into the frame so it looked more like he was coming out of it. So here I'm just taking some really thin pieces of clay, adding those to the backside, and then this is where, of course, it started to get messy. So I am just using some of that water on my finger, smoothing out any wrinkles or cracks or anywhere where you could see my finger marks in the clay. So just continue doing that until everything is nice and smooth. But as you can see, I wanted his head on the outside of the frame, his arms on the outside, and then that back piece to still kind of be in the frame. And of course, since I had to extend the back side of the ghost, I wanted to extend the front a little bit so it didn't look so awkward. And so then I just added some more thin pieces of clay to the front, and again just blending that in with my finger and some of the water. Once I was happy with how the ghost looked, then I just carefully picked him up from the frame, laid him onto a Dollar Tree cutting mat so that I could let that dry overnight. Then the next day, I did go ahead and recover that backing piece with another piece of velvet and position my ghost in the frame where I wanted him. Now you see here, I did end up having to tape the back of the bottom piece of the frame since I tucked the bottom part of the ghost down in there. But once I was happy with the positioning, then I just used some gel super glue to attach this in the frame and added some eyes with my black paint pen. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.